In this lecture, we're going to be just talking generally about the UX UI process and intro to thinking about interaction design. So we'll look at what is UX UI, planning, research, design, prototyping, and then we'll do a quick review of what we talked about. So UX is user experience. And to quote Don Norman, user experience encompasses all aspects of the end user's interaction with the company or organization and its services and products. So when we talk about UX, there's a lot that goes into the actual UX person. There's a lot that goes into the back end research. So when we think about UX in regards to the interface, it's more of like what happens when the user clicks this, or how to best structure the navigation for the user experience. But deep underlying of research goes into user experience before you even get to the visual part. So user experience functions off of what we call affordances. So for example, if we take a look at the doors here, this is like one of the classic user experience examples. First of all, user experience is everywhere. So we like to think of it in the digital space a lot, apps, websites, those type of things. But user experience is everywhere. User experience is everything from the interface in your car. How do you change the heat? How do you turn the radio up and down? A user experience is anything from that to user experience of product design. For example, Apple is famous for putting lots and lots of money behind their product design research and user testing. So thinking about how the user is going to react or interact with something. And user experience goes even as far as traffic flow and events. So Disney is a user experience. How do you control and flow all of that traffic? And then you have the fast pass. How does all of that work logistically and still wind up with a positive use from an experience for the user? So back to these stores, if you'll notice, here in the top one, somebody has labeled the door push, but we have been trained to push when we see a bar like that. So the push here is a little bit redundant as far as providing that information for the user, because with affordances you have to um, offer up basic assumptions of what a user is used to and operate on that, right? So from the digital space, that could look like, a younger person using a device or a website is probably super used to a lot of the things that they will be walking through. Whereas if you think of, excuse me, if you think of an older person who maybe they have to log into a health insurance website, or they have to log into something that provides important information to them, they may not be, first of all, definitely probably not as patient, but they might not be as used to digital spaces. So you really kind of have to spell things out and guide the user. So thinking about who's using it and what they currently know, based on the operations of what you plan to do. So looking back, so this one again we determined is a little bit redundant. And here you'll notice that we have two doors look exactly the same except for one says push and one says pull. So going back to user notions and how we've kind of been programmed and preconditioned to certain things. Typically when we see a handle like this, we know that we're supposed to pull, or it's fairly obvious that that's a handle that you are supposed to pull to open the door. So labeling pull, not, again, kind of like up here at the top with a push bar, not super necessary. But then we think on the left here, terrible user experience. If we're preconditioned to pull something that looks like a pull handle, telling us to push, that just means that you engineered your doors wrong. Very much a bad user experience. So when you think of affordances, you want to make sure that it's accessible and it's easy to complete a task, right? Everything, regardless of whether we're clicking a button or pushing a door, we're completing a task. And we want to make sure that we prevent any barriers to entry in our tasks and that we make it as easy and as straightforward as possible, right? You all have all looked at websites or used apps where it looks kind of fancy, but the usability of it actually sucks, right? So definitely a form versus function conversation. So thinking about affordances in the digital space, the most common that we're super familiar with are these shared Facebook buttons and tweet. So we as users are trained to a certain extent. So I know that, or I could venture to guess that if I, based on what it says here, share, tweet, if I click this button, the affordance is that it will allow me to share the content or allow me to tweet it out to Twitter. Okay. So thinking about users, who are these users? It's me, you, everybody. Obviously there's target markets and certain things that are driven towards specific people. If you're designing an app for kids to use, obviously that's very specific, and those users have very specific needs. But generally, users consume and use content across the board. There's certain situations where it's targeted towards a specific person, but we need to make sure that when we're thinking of users, we're being as inclusive as possible and trying to make sure we've explored every avenue that might prevent, um, you know, something to be unusable, right? So phases. So when we think of user experience as a job or what that role that person plays, and again, user experience and UI are typically, once you get in the industry, those are typically two completely different positions. You got the UI, which is the person doing the front end development, and then you have someone working in UX. That's very research driven. Okay, so typically we start with the client industry research, user research. Then we think about our information architecture, and then we wireframe, and then we start with visual design, and then we go through several phases of prototyping and testing. So client and industry research, thinking about who are the users, right? So we ask questions. How will this affect us? What are the goals? What are the objectives? How are we, making money for this, or a lot of times profiting from this? What is the goal here? So thinking again of the user research, who is the primary target audience? What are their needs, their personality types, preferred interaction methods, web behaviors? So again, going back to that maybe age of the person, what is a typical web behavior for someone who is 35 versus a particular web behavior for someone who is 78, right? Just being aware of the full spectrum of that. What graphics and design styles do they react to? And the react to could be a good reaction or a bad reaction, right? Also thinking about accessibility in your user research. So typically with user research, we begin with a persona, right? And personas are based on research. They are not actual people, but they're based on our user and target audience demographic research. So essentially, there might be a couple of different personas that you're working from, but you use this data to essentially create a sample person, a sample persona. Anything from who they are to what they do, what their goal might be for the site. You could even create a journey map for that, which documents if they're trying to complete a certain task. What steps would they take for that task? And then motivations, right? Like, what are their motivations? And not motivation as in like, mental motivation, but why would they be using this? What are they trying to do? And then the user's goals. So again, what might their goals be versus our goals in the way that we engineer this experience, whatever that experience may be. And then there's different variables. So variables could be anything from how they think about user interactions to any other challenges, right? Different variables that might prevent us from achieving this goal. So this helps us troubleshoot early on in the research process. So then we get to information architecture. So before we actually get to any design, we have to think about the overall structure, like our roadmap to this information. Okay, so and we begin to build what the content might look like. It's still not visual, it's very much more of just a wireframe situation, but I do want to give you this example. This is it's been a couple of versions now, but this is Old Navy's website before they redesigned it a couple of years ago. And I don't know if you guys use Old Navy as much as I do, but this is a great example, and I wanted to show this one because as one of their avid users, it's something that I noticed and picked up on very quickly, and it's also a really great just general example. So they actually used to have, you'll notice in their nav bar here, they have all of these options. They've got women, women's plus, maternity, men, girls, boys. So they have since condensed this a little bit in the main nav. So if you go to their new site, it's just you click women, and then that expands, and you have these other options, men, and then they have kids, where they list girls and boys under kids, and then they have baby, where they put toddler and baby all together. So yes, they did create, a sub navigation, but they essentially cleaned up. They condensed this main nav. And so, if you are looking for baby stuff, you click baby, and then the certain area that you're looking for pops up. So it's a very much more direct way of getting to what you want. Now, another thing that they did too is that they made their hero area much more active and beneficial by doing featured content and sales, but a lot more engaging than what is currently here in their new update. So the next step is in this UX process, because remember we're still in UX, is wireframing. So we organize and visualize our content. So thinking here, if this is a prototype wireframe for an insurance app, we've got our home area. So this is like insurance claims is what we're doing here. So we've got the home area, and then when we click that, we go to, if we click make a claim, we go to make a claim. So following, using the wireframing not only for what the UI might look like, but for what that journey would be with a certain task, right? So really getting the full feel of what the experience might be before you ever actually build it. So design, and I want you guys to notice how far the design, even once we talk about UI, the design phase is very far into this whole process. Okay, so you have to think about it, you have to do your research and figure things out before you just jump into designing things, right? So with design, it's post wireframing. This is where we begin to design the front interface. We share with users, we get feedback, we make necessary design changes based on that feedback. And then we go into prototype and testing. So what you're seeing here to the left, a lot of times people will build these little paper prototypes and put them in hands of users. So paper prototyping, or whether you have a digital prototype in XD that you provide somebody, there's lots of different ways to go about prototyping and testing. So this is where, in prototyping and testing, this is where all the ingredients come together. You prototype the interface, and a lot of times this is still very much a low-fi, low fidelity interface. So it may not even be the most robust design yet. It's just a generic layout. You can prototype in lots of different phases. And then you share with users and get feedback, and then you make necessary changes based on that feedback. So one thing that I want to put on your radar is this user testing. This is a very deep process. A lot of times, if we go back to Apple, Apple user tests, and we know when they release a product, there's usually like immediately the couple weeks after there's a bunch of updates that they release, because even all the user testing that they did still couldn't 100% work out all the kinks that users might eventually entail, right? Lots of variables there, especially if you're thinking about prototyping and testing an iPhone, a new iPhone software. But professionally, whether you're a product design or web design or whatever industry, prototyping testing is an integral part of that, and it's a process that goes back and forth a lot before we finally get to that final prototype or the final one that we plan to put out into the universe and to launch. Okay. All right, so we are going to stop here, and in the next video, we'll come back to user interface.